challenge to understand the humanities through this theme, through the lens of keywords. And the notion of keywords is by definition dynamic, and this theme invites reflection on a wide variety of topics, which you'll see represented in our 12 presentations today. In line with the interdisciplinary nature of this term, keywords, our projects span diverse topics throughout temporal and geographic spaces, revealing the fluidity and mobility of ideas and concepts throughout time and space. When we were brainstorming the title of the symposium and kind of just reflecting on the notion of keywords in general, we compiled a list of our own keywords pertaining to our projects. And this list, as you can imagine, is really heterogeneous and represents the incredible diversity of our projects. So to think about words in flux means to think about words in their continual and ever-changing genesis. And we hope to capture that fluidity and dynamicity in each of our projects. As undergraduate humanities fellows, we met weekly and learned from each other's disciplines. And this interaction among subject areas epitomized the very nature of keywords as mobile concepts.
And so today we will hear from our wonderful 12 undergraduate fellows organized into 4 panels. And so to start, it will be Global Connections, Toxic Luxuries. This panel will explore the influence of luxury items and cultures of trade in the pre-modern era. Our second panel will be Remembered Through Language, which will discuss individual histories within small communities of Philadelphia's religious Korean institutions, Philadelphia Chinatown, and towns along the Rio Grande's US-Mexico border. Our third panel will be Representations of Space and Aesthetics, which will investigate keywords embodied in objects and online communities in communist Russia and 21st century online cultures, respectively. Radical Interventions will explore the notion of keywords embodied in revolutionary figures and collective movements. Each of these very, very unique projects trace the interwoven and ever-evolving nature of language. Our projects challenge traditional concepts of storytelling, social change, economic markets, and literature. Our research is truly possible in the protection of academic freedom and the celebration of diversity, equity, inclusion of all people and their ideas. We hope you enjoy the journey we trace as we follow these ideas in motion and these words in flux.
And then just real quick before we begin, we did want to make several acknowledgements before we kick off the symposium because our work really would not be possible without a lot of people behind the scenes. Dr. Vokalantsev, thank you for your time in guiding us through our research journeys and providing your insight in our weekly workshopping. Sarah, Pamela, Erin, Angelina, everyone in the Wolf Center, really, thank you for doing all that you do to keep the Wolf Center running. This space is an invaluable resource for inspiring humanities research at Penn, and it's been integral in all of our humanistic journeys in our undergraduate careers. So we appreciate your efforts in all of the little things from keeping us fed with vegetables to the big things like making today happen. We will miss meeting in Williams 623 every week.
And And with that, we would like to kick off our first panel of the day. Please welcome Jenny, Eug, and Daphne for Global Connections, Toxic Luxuries, moderated by Dr. John Pollack.
Morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks to Taryn and Tova, wonderful introduction. And let me also recommend not homework, but that everyone read their welcome in the program here. Beautifully written, and there are a couple things I'd like to pull out from it very quickly and introduce our speakers. Fluidity and mobility, I think we'll be thinking a lot about those terms and other related keywords today. They also note, and we were just hearing them talk about, the vital work of both cultivating academic discourse, and you're going to hear some very smart talks today, and also forming friendships. I like the pairing of those two things. I like the power I see on the faces in the audience here, and I am honored to do this because These are not students, these are our friends and our colleagues and our fellow researchers, and I feel like we're and should be arm in arm together. So I will just at the beginning of the day offer congratulations to all of you on your excellent year's work, and looking forward to hearing you, and of course to all the future projects. Our first panel, as you can see, is entitled Global Connections and Toxic Luxuries. There is some power, but maybe some pain in that title, because I'm sorry that it now feels like the global has become toxic for many in our United Statesian world at the moment. But I'd like to think that these three talks will offer reminders about how our histories are not separate but connected, and how those connections, toxic though they may be sometimes, challenging though they always are, can offer also strength and support as well. So we are going to focus in this session, of course, on words and keywords, but also on products, bodies, and commodities, and how they move across space and time, and also across formats and forms: manuscript, print, paper, parchment, textile, and others, I'm sure. I'm going to introduce our three speakers one by one. So I will start, and so I will pop up again, because I like to do it that way. And it's really a pleasure to begin the morning with Jenny. Jenny Fu. Jenny's a senior. We can applaud her now. And again, Jenny's a senior in the College of Arts and Sciences here. She's double majoring in English and PPE. If you forgot what that stands for, that's philosophy, politics, and economics. I never know whether the politics or the philosophy come first, but she put philosophy first. That's good. Her research interests include 19th and 20th century literature, poetry and poetics, globalization, East-West contact, and translation. Outside of the classroom, Jenny's involved in the English Undergraduate Advisory Board and Penn 6 a cappella. Maybe we can get to that later. She's a reader, of course, a creative writer, singer, and a long walker outdoors. And Jenny's title this morning, The Flows of Informal Empire, reading the Malay as a Lascar sailor in Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater. Over to you, Jenny. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today, and it's my great honor to start the day as the first panelist speaker today. And before I start, I would also like to thank my advisor, Professor Emily Steinlight, who's also sitting in the audience, because this project would not be possible without her support. So. And today my project is The Flows of Informal Empire, reading the Malay as a Lascar sailor in Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater. This text is well remembered for its Orientalist representation of the Orient in his opium-induced dream visions. And I want to start with a passage from his dream visions. De Quincey writes in May 1818 in the form of a diary entry, "The Malay has been a fearful enemy for months. I have been every night through his means transported into Asiatic scenes. I know not whether others shares in my feelings on this point, but I have often thought that if I were compelled to forego England and to live in China and among Chinese manners and modes of life and scenery, I should go mad." The diary entry then goes on a tirade against not only China, but also South Asia, India, and Egypt, all of which he clumps into a descriptively differentiated but functionally totalized Orient. However, a few questions remain. Why is De Quincey's Orient primarily Asian? Why does he single out China? And who is this Malay? Why does De Quincey view him antagonistically? And why does he attribute to him the particular act of transport? The term transport can be interpreted several ways. De Quincey may have used it to highlight the emotional and psychological intensity of these dreams. He may also have used it to highlight opium as the agent inducing these dreams, where the narcotic courses through his blood and takes a hold over his mind. But these interpretations cannot explain why it is the Malay specifically who transports De Quincey. Of course, transport also means to take or carry people or goods from one place to another by means of a vehicle, aircraft, or ship. While this meaning appears out of place, it explains why De Quincey uses the specific vocabulary of transport and why the Malay is the agent of transport. Malays and South Asians more generally were part of a historical labor group known as Lascars. The community comprises a diverse range of identities, including people from East Africa, Bengal, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, China, and elsewhere. Since the early 17th century, English merchant ships traveling from the East Indies to England recruited Lascars, and their usage spiked in 1793 after the outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars. During this period, English merchant seamen were regularly enlisted into the Royal Navy, which increased the demand for Lascar labor on merchant ships. Asian sailors were almost exclusively employed for commerce, especially by the British East India Company that traded tea and opium across the Indian Ocean. Between 1803 and 1813, the number of Asian sailors that arrived in Britain rose, from an annual average of over 300 between 1803 and 1804 to over 1,000 between 1812 and 1813. Even though this number fell by the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, many Asian sailors remained in Britain due to the Navigation Acts, which restricted ships from leaving Britain from employing Asian sailors, creating a surplus of employable Lascars that stayed behind. Given that De Quincey wrote Confessions in 1821, only a few years after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and also given the growing population of Asian sailors who stayed in London, it seems plausible for De Quincey to write of a Malay Lascar involved in the transport of Oriental commodities such as opium. And thus, my aim for this project is to read the Malay as a Lascar sailor whose labor was presumably intertwined with the transport of these Oriental commodities. By paying attention to how Confessions mediates maritime labor and commerce, I argue that the text negotiates the flow of people and goods within one of Britain's most consequential free trade projects of the period, the opium trade. Our analysis, then, must begin with the Malay figure himself, whose markedly oceanic body traverses through the mountainous English countryside. De Quincey writes, "One day a Malay knocked on my door. What business a Malay could have to transact among English mountains, I cannot conjecture, but possibly he was on his road to a seaport about 40 miles distant." De Quincey's response to the Malay's spontaneous but polite approach to his rented cottage reads almost like a light-hearted surprise. Though somewhat amazed, he rationalizes why the Malay is traveling through the English mountains. As with the considerable presence of Lascars in England, he assumes that the Malay is probably a sailor on his road to a seaport about 40 miles distant. To De Quincey, the Malay's body and labor belongs to oceanic transport, and thus he assumes that the Malay has no business to transact on the mountains and must be heading to a port nearby. However, he immediately disrupts the narrative's realist and explanatory dimensions. The servant who opened the door to him was a young girl. I'll just read this quote. "The servant who opened the door to him was a young girl, born and bred among the English mountains, who had never seen an Asiatic dress of any sort. The girl, recollecting the reputed learning of her master, came and gave me to understand that there was a sort of demon below, whom she clearly imagined that my art could exorcise from the house." By mediating this unexpected, though not wholly inexplicable encounter through a lightly ironic paraphrase of the servant girl's provincial perspective, De Quincey recreates the Malay as a supernatural figure. The girl's reaction casts the Malay as potentially dangerous and disruptive, sensationalizing the encounter, enticing De Quincey's readers, and making them want more of the narrative. The ambivalent quality of this Malay figure mirrors the commodities that his maritime labor may have helped circulate in Britain's Asia trade. Tea and opium were among the prominent goods traded by the British East India Company, and their effects on British society were debated as a topic of national health and security. For instance, some argued that consuming a foreign substance like tea would pollute the British character, while others, especially the voices in lead with Samuel Johnson, contended that tea is congruous with normal routines and general English well-being. The Malay's presence in the English mountains is characterized by a similar ambivalence, in which he, like the commodities that he makes available, is at once threatening and beguiling, creating simultaneous repulsion and attraction for De Quincey's contemporary readers. And thus, the fantastical construal of the Malay brings to light his precarious relationship with the English body politic. De Quincey further describes the Malay using extraordinary imagery through this quote, producing a striking blend of the real and the fantastical. In a cottage kitchen, but paneled on the wall with dark wood that from age and rubbing resembled oak, and looking more like a rustic hall of entrance than a kitchen, stood the Malay, his turban and loose trousers of dingy white relieved upon the dark paneling. He had placed himself nearer to the girl than she seemed to relish, though her native spirit of mountain intrepidity contended with the feeling of simple awe which her countenance expressed as she gazed upon the tiger cat before her. In this passage, the kitchen is transformed into a rustic hall of entrance, reminiscent of Gothic horror magnifying the Malay's terrifying figure. By comparing him to a tiger cat, De Quincey draws from nursery folklore in which the infamous tigerish persona of Tipu, Sultan of Mysore, is the oriental tiger that the British love to hate. The close positioning of this dangerous demonic animal figure near the servant girl has a double effect. On the level of narrative, the Malay's proximity to the young servant girl hints that he is a sexual threat, which would have reminded De Quincey's readers of late 18th century Oriental tales featuring the sexual oppression and exploitation of women by Eastern figures of a tyrannical masculinity. Such conventional depictions hold a self-reinforcing power through the cultural imaginary developed from the popularity of Oriental tales. On the level of history, the male-dominant constitution of the Lascar community, along with growing fears of a multiracial port population, had caused anxiety over racial mixing. Informal economies grew as Lascars stayed in Britain, where British sex workers reportedly specialized in entertaining them. One notable incident occurred in 1803, where 3 Lascars armed with cutlasses sought to recover money from local sex workers who allegedly stole from them. The Lascars were subsequently arrested, but soon bailed out and put on an outgoing ship for their better protection from the women of the town. Despite this seemingly benign language of protecting Lascars from the British community, this incident suggests an anxiety over the possibility of miscegenation between working-class white British women and Asian sailors. By routing a representation of the Malay through Orientalist conventions, De Quincey's text thus forms a double-layered resistance to the naturalization of Lascar seamen. Not only is there historical precedent for the fear of Lascar integration into British society, but the terrifying cultural imaginary of the Malay's tigerish persona wielded at this moment of perception, compared to the previous mundane introduction of this figure, signifies a complete change of register that exoticizes the Malay sailor and resists his homogenization into British society. However, De Quincey's description of the Malay skin interrupts this process of exoticization. De Quincey writes, "In a more striking picture there cannot be imagined than the beautiful English face of the girl, and its exquisite fairness, together with her erect and independent attitude, contrasted with the sallow and bilious skin of the Malay, enameled or veneered with mahogany by marine air, his small, fierce, restless eyes, thin lips, slavish gestures and adorations." The Malay skin is sallow and bilious, but also enameled or veneered with mahogany by marine air. a phrase that oddly recreates the Malays' maritime experience by objectifying him as mahogany wood, a material widely used in both naval and merchant shipbuilding at the time. By creating an association between the Malay skin and the ship, De Quincey draws attention to the Malay's lived experience as a Lascar sailor. There is also a simultaneous conflict and resolution between the Malay sailor on a merchant vessel and the cottage kitchen wall, now reappraised by De Quincey as paneled with dark wood that from age and rubbing resembled oak. As Isaac Land shows, the oak tree was not only used in shipbuilding, but was invested with a great moral significance as the emblem of the British people, standing for the sturdy, reliable, and masculine virtues that made and kept the nation strong. As Land also shows convincingly, sailors of color have often used the oaken ship to remind the British metropole of their contributions to the empire and help them claim a kind of street citizenship. Thus, De Quincey's Malay Lascar, so dissonant to the mountainous pastoralism of Cumbria, so incongruously positioned against the emphatic localism and white Englishness of the servant girl, takes on an uneasy affinity with this space. We can start to untangle this paradox by considering the valences of the Malays' labor and the opium trade itself. Peter Lennebaugh and Marcus Reidecker observed that ships were the engines of commerce, the machines of empire, transporting commodities foundational to the prosperity of imperial powers. By the late 18th century, the China trade was a central endeavor of the East India Company. The company's massive tea imports generated a trade deficit that was balanced by the illicit trade of opium, which is also the narcotic at the heart of De Quincey's text. Opium grown in India was transported to Canton via Calcutta on ships officered by Europeans and manned by Lascars. Not only did it balance the trade deficit, but it also generated a considerable amount of wealth that was deemed too much to give up. As Sanjay Krishna notes, passage through the Straits of Malacca and the Malay archipelago made for the shortest distance between the ports of Calcutta and Canton, and it did not take long to realize that whoever controlled the Malacca Straits had an effective stranglehold on the immensely profitable China trade. De Quincey's text was published in 1821 at the end of the decades marked by this endeavor, and so this may explain why De Quincey identifies the Malay Lascar as a Malay, despite the labor group's diverse nature and the company's general lack in documenting their specific ethnic backgrounds. And through this Malay Lascar, De Quincey not only demonstrates a familiarity with colonial labor, but in acknowledging the opium trade through this figure, reaffirms how commerce and empire go hand in hand. And accordingly, we see in this passage, the Malay Lascar's presence prompts De Quincey to reappraise his residence in rural Grasmere. The dark wood inside the plain kitchen is transformed into oak, suggestive of both his transport of opium and his own transport to England via merchant ships. The Malay's access to the kitchen door, reimagined as a rustic hall of entrance, symbolizes his entry into England's global imperial enterprise and the English domestic space through maritime travel. The cottage interior becomes a liminal space where the boundary between the land and sea dissolves. This dissolution has important implications if we take the iconography of the Lake District and Dove Cottage seriously. Dove Cottage is famous as the home of William Wordsworth, from whom De Quincey rented it in 1809. It is also the canonical site where Wordsworth wrote many of his most celebrated poems. We know from De Quincey's letters and journals that he was well acquainted with many renowned Romantic writers, including Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Charles Lamb, and Robert Southey, but it was Wordsworth's poetry that he admired the most. As his biographer Greville Lindop says, Wordsworth's influence on De Quincey dates back to his first reading of the lyrical ballads, in which the preface defines poetry as the image of man and nature and as the product of emotion recollected in tranquility. To De Quincey, the Grasmere countryside represents a retreat from the city, a place free from disturbance, helping one reach peace of mind. By decreasing the amount of opium he ingests, he feels that a latter spring had come to close up the season of youth, allowing him to resume his studies in a healthy state of mind. In this light, the arrival of the Malay carries unique irony for De Quincey's narrative, as it marks an intrusion into this tranquility of the mountainous region. The Malay's disruption of De Quincey's specifically romantic subjectivity, brings about his transport into the chaotic series of Oriental dreams. At the same time, the Malay also revises the economic and material valences of this cottage. According to Malcolm Andrews, the traditional English cottage represented in its architectural form the local resources that came to hand most abundantly in different regions of the country. The local provenance of the cottage material is core to its status as an indigenous icon of Englishness, an idealized pastoral frugality, nationalistic history, heroized Englishness, and also we can add here a canonical site of English Romantic poetry. In his study of English localism, identity, and imperial expansion, Ian Balcom argues that place-based identifications of Englishness with the locale serve to defend an authentic, pure, and settled way of being English. He observes that William Wordsworth's Dove Cottage serves as an icon, which describes objects, places, and events that symbolize a collective and continuous national memory, preserving England's essential identity from imperial transformation. One's identification with such locales marks not only a reunion with the English countryside, but also with the English mind and character, with a way of feeling. As such, the setting of Dove Cottage invokes a nationalism embedded within the cult of localism. The countryside's seclusion from the globalizing forces of empire, as well as London's metropolitanism, becomes essential to the Englishness that De Quincey assumes both metaphorically and literally through the narrative setting. His reimagining of the cottage as a space negotiating the landlocked locale in England's overseas trade undermines this localist tradition, revealing that the remote countryside is imbricated within the networks of imperial commerce. Such reimagining finds ground in the historical reality of Grasmere itself. Rather than a remote and homogeneous English village unchanged by history and global commerce, Grasmere is actually not far from major seaports, such as Whitehaven, which was also involved in the tobacco, sugar, and Atlantic slave trade. In this light, the outlandish appearance of the Malay Lascar is not so incredible after all. And likewise, in recounting the Malay's visit, the narrator casts the cottage house as a site of opium exchange. De Quincey writes, "If any man from Oxford or Cambridge, or neither, had been announced to me in my unpretending cottage of laudanum, I would have given him as much as he wished." Does the narrator plot the cottage within the coordinates of imperial exchange? In either case, the Malay Lascar and his labor, the circulation of commodities enabled by his labor, all accumulate to the expansion of empire itself, which interrupt the highly provincialized and essentialized Englishness imagined by the Romantic poets and the national collective, and also by De Quincey in his own narrative. By means of the Malay, the narrator is metaphorically transported out of the cult of localism into the networks of trade, just as how De Quincey himself is materially connected to Asia through opium transported by Lascars in his own life. As De Quincey negotiates the national here and the imperial there, he is forced to reappraise the binaries between the land and the sea, the metropole and the countryside, as well as notions of connectivity and isolation. By mediating the forces of commerce and labor through the opium trade, De Quincey's text acknowledges the two-way flow of imperial expansion, forcing him to recognize the pervasiveness of empire at home. Thank you.
Thank you for that terrific opening talk, Jenny. And we'll move right on to our next speaker, who's Daphne Glatter, a sixth-floor regular, who is, in addition to being a Wolf Undergraduate Fellow, of course, a senior, English and Ancient History majors, and minoring, I didn't know this, in mathematics, wow, as well as Global Medieval Studies. Okay, she can teach us all. And as you might be able to know from those majors, Daphne has diverse research interests ranging from classical antiquity to the contemporary world, poetics, aesthetics, intellectual history, and philology. Daphne's presentation today is entitled Points of Interest, Pre-Modern Keywords in MS Cotton Nero AX. Daphne, over to you.
Hi, thank you all so much for coming out this morning. Thank you all so much for coming out this morning. And this talk has been retitled to Golden Points, Luxury, Epistemology, and Virtue in the Pearl Poems. So what I'd like to start off with is, if you are familiar with the famous phrase from De Beers, "A diamond is forever," they totally changed the landscape for diamonds and luxury items by cleanly associating diamonds with marriage. Diamond is forever, right? And this is pretty true for a lot of luxury items. The idea that gold is, wealth, pearls are purity, purple is royal, and so on and so forth. But what this talk is going to look into is, in these, 5 special poems, what happens when some luxury items, gold, jewels, pearls, purple cloth, etc., don't exactly mean what we think that they mean. So, this is from the English Royal Treasury, and today we are looking at, again, 5 poems from the Cottonero A10 manuscript, 4 poems: Pearl, Patience, Cleanness, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and then the 5th called St. Erkenwald, that's in a similar dialect. So here we go. Here's an image of it. It's pretty ugly, not gonna lie. It's very special, actually, insofar as it's one of the first manuscripts that has full-page illustrations. This is from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. The Green Knight has been beheaded, and everyone's kind of like, whoa. So, some basics on Cottonero A10. So it's from the 14th century. It's anonymous. It's in the Cheshire or Staffordshire dialect, so you can see those counties have been boxed off on the map. So you can see it's a little bit far from London. London's all the way down there. So this manuscript is a bit provincial, so to speak. So it's interesting that it engages so deeply with court culture and luxuries. It's just worth keeping in mind. This is a one-of-one manuscript. It's the only one that we've got. It has the only extant copies of these 4 masterpieces of Middle English alliterative poetry. They share a similar dialect and verse form. And this 5th poem, St. Erkenwald, actually survives in a couple of copies. We don't really know about the authorship. The point, though, is that the dialect and the verse form are similar enough that it's really worth analyzing them together, even if we don't really know who the author is. Should also note that these titles are editorial. They're unnamed in the manuscript. So just a little bit on these poems. Pearl is a dream vision. There's a discourse between the dreamer and his probably dead daughter named the Pearl Maiden, and they sort of talk about belief and virtue and divinity. Cleanness and patience are homilies. So they, retell biblical exemplars from the Hebrew Bible for virtue-based purposes, and that's going to be really important for us. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is the quote-unquote secular poem. Gawain is challenged to a beheading game by the mysterious Green Knight, and a really bizarre non-adventure follows. That's probably the best poem in the manuscript. You should read it. And then St. Erkenwald is in London. The Bishop Erkenwald is called to investigate a corpse dressed as a pre-Norman king and uncover its identity. Okay. So I think it's important just for a second to take a look at the verse of these poems, because that's going to be really important as we look into how they construct epistemology, which I want to talk about. And I've, translated some of this for you on the side in prose. But, the most important exemplar is really, this is from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. The verse form is the bob and wheel. So we have alliterative long lines, a very short line at the end, and then this, 4-line rhyming wheel. And the bob and wheel keeps the poetry moving. And this is something that we're going to see, that the verse form in these poems lulls us into a false sense of security in terms of knowing what's true and what's not, whereas the content on the page says otherwise. So, we have that apparently the Green Knight is very snatched, and that in the back, so we have, for the back and breast, all his body sterling, both his womb and his waist were wonderfully small, all his features full and form, that he had full clean. For wonder of his human hade, set ensemblet scene, he förde des frick fade and orre enker green. So he's green and snatched. That's crazy. And we also have the verse of Pearl. And this is really important. I really want you to pay attention to this, that this is a really intricate verse form. And the key thing over here is the linking line and the linking word. And this is again going to play for us that the linking line and the word here is spot, and we're playing with its meaning. So you can see that this is a very tight, this is an iambic tetrameter, and we're rhyming. So per plaisant prince payet, calamly close and gold so clear, out of orient, e hardly say, ni prude, I never hear precious pear, so on and so forth. And this is talking about the value and, you know, the singularity of this pearl. And the key thing over here is, of that pretty pearl without in spot, sitting in that spot he from me sprang, of half a weighted wishanda that whale. You can see it's spot. That's the word that we're playing with over here. That's the meaning that we're altering. And what the verse form is doing over here is lulling us into a false sense of security, okay? We're saying spot, spot, we're moving, we're rolling along. The tetrameter verse also keeps us rolling along. What we're going to find is that the poetics do a really nice obscuring job for us. So, you know, it might be worth thinking for a second I'm talking about vernacular epistemology. So the question is, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is heuristics. That is the mental shortcuts that we take to understand the world. So for instance, okay, you go to like AP microeconomics or something like that. You're told about the supply and the demand curve. This is a useful heuristic, right? This helps explain some basic facts about the world. It's useful to think about, but in reality, you know, economics are a lot more complicated. So that's where behavioral economics, for instance, come in, this idea that like people's behavior is as much a determining factor as just, you know, these curves and this equilibrium. So, you know, taking this back to the 14th century, what we have is by epistemology, I really mean this in the most traditional sense, of cognitive successes and failures. So how we interpret evidence from the world to determine what's true and false. And then by vernacular epistemology, so vernacular drawing on the idea of the common language, the vernacular, in this case, that would be English, but in general, the common heuristic. I mean, the typical common or down-to-earth ways people know what they know, in opposition to the mystical, esoteric, vernacular epistemologies constitute the heuristics of everyday life based on politics and popular culture. So that's where those supply and demand curves come in, right? They're useful, but they don't really show you the whole picture, okay? And the key thing here to look at this is like, in terms of understanding the heuristics of the Pearl poems and their epistemologies, there's two kind of salient things to look at, which are sartorial adornment and sort of vices and virtues, and this really schematic way of doing things. So sartorial adornment, this has to do with sumptuary laws, the idea that what you wear is indicative of your social class. These are prescriptive, they're not descriptive. When these things exist, it indicates that there's actually a little bit more slippage than we want to show. That, you know, if you think about today, you know, oh, everyone has a pair of Vehas or Golden Goose or whatever, and then you can't actually tell what social class they are. This is trying to regulate that, and this is from 1379. So this is contemporaneous with the poems from the reign of Richard II. And we have, you know, item that no man or woman within the said kingdom, except knights or ladies, shall wear any kind of fur, cloth or gold, or ribbon of gold, or cloth of silk if they cannot spend 40 pounds a year. So there's this prescriptive attempt at doing this. Some scholarship indicates that these things really weren't enforced all that well, or they were complied with. But the point is that these are on the books, and there's this effort to say, we're going to differentiate social class, status, and reality based on things, material things. And then, you know, that's a little bit schematic, right? Saying that, you know, knights and ladies can do this, but if you're below that, you can't. And that really brings us into this idea of the vices and virtues. So let's look at saying, here are the vices, here are the virtues. So, you know, some like cardinal sins and cardinal successes. So for instance, piety, you know, chastity, temperance, you know, truth, and so on. These are all contrasted with vices like sloth, gluttony, and so on. And they have a really schematic way of doing this in the 14th century. So this is a tree of vices and virtues. I hope you can see it well. The leaves that are going up, these are the virtues, the ones that are going down are the vices. And the key thing is that these are put in opposition to each other. There's a clean link between them. Everything fits together really well. And, this is another example of just something like that. And there's a lot of examples of this. There are ladders, there are wheels, there are, any number of like schematic items you can think of. There's an illustration for that. Okay. So these are, this is these are two vernacular epistemologies of this period. And what we're going to see is the Pearl poems set up this epistemology and then break it down. Okay. So here's where we're going to go. And this is where the verse has to do with it. So we're setting up clean links between the virtue of cleanness. So that's, temperance, chastity, and so on, and truth. That's saying, in order to understand God and to have favor and to know what you have to have temperance. And that's where this alliterative verse form comes in. It's keeping us rolling along and saying, cleanness who so keenly kof kamen, and frecken all the reasons that whole by feet askes, fair form is meet he fiend and forthering his speech, and the contrary cark and cumbrance huge. So what you have over here is that cleanness commends us, and then we will find fair forms and founding speech. So we will be akin to God, politics, your other people, if you're temperate. And that's what the verse is doing over here. The alliteration is linking these ideas together. Cleanness, whoso, kindly could commend. Okay, and, I want to read it out loud also so you can get a sense really of how this rolls along. And then, we have another example with sartorial adornment over here that this is an illustration of the parable of the banquet. It's in cleanness. And there's this idea over here that you have to be rightly dressed and that what you're wearing is akin to your virtue. So this, quite interestingly links with these sumptuary laws we were looking at over here. So we have this is, this lord shows up, and then, this man, he was for a holiday not for a holiday honestly arrayed, all the three in the throng unbridely clothed. And then, there's this thing over here, bind this guy, take him away. He's not properly dressed. What he's wearing is indicative of his virtue. So that's what we're setting up, but we're going to break it down, okay? And, we're going to start with this idea of like these points over here, these schema. And this is another full page illustration from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which brings us, this idea of these vices and virtues that are linked together. So this is from Gawain and the Green Knight. Sir Gawain has a pentangle. It's 5-pointed star. And its idea, he has 5 fives, 5 virtues that correspond to the 5 points of his pentangle. These are schematic. This is very similar to these trees of vices and virtues that we're looking at. So, his cleanness and his courtesy crooked were never, and pity that passes all the points, virtues, cleanness, courtesy, piety, and so on. And this is kind of a long passage over here, but we're linking these ideas together based on schema. This is vernacular. This is heuristic. And another example comes from Patience. So this is an interesting illustration of Jonah and the whale. It's pretty awesome, I think. And, this is another example where we have, these 8 beatitudes, these 8 virtues, poverty, pity, penance, meekness, mercy, cleanness, peace, patience. And then, these are points together, 8 points that say this is how you know. But the poems are going to say not so fast. And what we find is a really salient example comes again from cleanness. So unfortunately, cleanness doesn't have illustrations in the manuscript. I would have loved that. But a really salient example comes from the long exemplar, which is the story of Daniel and Belshazzar. So this is one illustration of that. There's Daniel saying that's, mane, mane, tekel, etc. from that particular story. And we have a misleading luxury over here. So Belshazzar over here is worshiping idols. That's in Daniel, but the way they describe it in the poem is really interesting, that these are gilded items. But false phantoms of Fandus formed with hands, when they are gilded all with gold and girded with silver, Okay, so the idea is these are gilded items. The luxury items that we're looking at over here don't correspond to reality. That's what's going on with the sartorial adornment and these vices and virtues saying, oh, we can prescribe reality based on the items that we're looking at. But as we can see, the naked eye, human sight, a vernacular epistemology based on material things doesn't quite work. And that's what Daniel says in this expansion in the cleanness poem, because this isn't in the biblical story. This particular thing, says these things was seeked and set him at little, and now his vessels of idol and vanity unclean. Okay? You see with your eye, you see these things with sight, but you don't understand. You're looking and you're seeing material items. You're seeing these glittering gold, but it's gilded. That's the key distinction over here. And that's what these poems are really setting up. That gold is gold, but it doesn't mean what you think it means. There's this real distinction here between these gilded and solid items. And there's a theological reason behind this, right? How you worship God correctly, but this is also epistemological. Okay? And we have this other really interesting example from Pearl. So this is from Pearl. There's the dreamer conversing with the Pearl Maiden. She looks like she has a bad night's sleep. Yikes. So this is another really interesting thing that really brings us into the verse. Okay? This play on these two words, maculas and masculas. So spotless and singular. And if you're in the English Honors Thesis Symposium, you saw this close reading already. Thank you. So there's this idea over here that this is where the alliteration and the punning is coming into play. The verse is setting up the epistemological problem for us. Masculine, and this is really also where the Middle English comes in, because if you read this in translation, it doesn't make as much sense. Why masculine spirit that reef from plan that raids hats or reach and reef? What king thing may that lamb that won't be wed unto his reef? All only thyself so stout and stiff, a masculus may a masculus. Only yourself so stout and stiff, a peerless pearl without a spot. So we're saying purity and peerlessness are the same. But that's coming from this punning and these similar words, maculus and masculus. So peerless and pure, okay? And then it's like masculus quoth that mirrored queen, unblemished em without blot, and that may you with men's maintain, but maculus queen then said e not. So spotless, yes, I am pure, but I am not singular. Okay, that's really going against what you would think in this poem, because she's a virgin bride of Christ. Here, it's a very strange situation. Theologically, what we're looking at is faith. This is a question of faith that we're looking at over here and saying, well, that's what faith does. This is Christian doctrine. That's Christ and his virgin brides, okay? But in terms of an epistemological level, there's this mistake that we're making between peerlessness and purity. The pearl means spotless, but it's not singular. And that's really interesting, especially because in this period, you have pearls really associated with someone like the Virgin Mary, who's a really singular person. So these poems are actually a little bit transgressive insofar as you have something that's really counterintuitive. But what we're saying is material things obscure reality. You need something else. You need something beyond heuristics. And what I really want to emphasize here is the verse and the outward facing look of this is obfuscating. Truth and reality and appearance, these are, the verse conceals and reveals at the same time. So, what we sort of get is like, well, is there a way out of this? So this poem, St. Erkenwald, is pretty interesting to look at that with, insofar as we have this corpse that looks like a king, right? So we're wondering, how do we get out of this? So this corpse has a scepter, he's got a crown, he's got robes, and everyone thinks that's a king. That's not actually true. And what happens is St. Erkenwald turns to this corpse and talks to him and says, hey, answer me, what are you? No one knows what's happening. And it turns out this is a judge. It turns out this is actually a judge. And what this is telling us in terms of what these poems are saying, how to know what you know, there's a faith question over here. There's theological impetus behind this. But the point is also inquiry and heuristics, especially based on language. There's this real thing over here between the verse, the alliteration, the punning, and then looking beyond the surface and saying maculas and masculas are not the same. Gilded and solid are two separate things. A pearl can be peerless, but not, a pearl can be spotless, but not peerless, which is very counterintuitive. So, you know, the question over here is, well, that's great. What do we do with this now? You know, what's the relevance? Why do we care? Number one, it's interesting. And it's also worth thinking about, you know, especially we live in an age of alternative facts, disinformation. The Yemen chat did not have concealed info in it, okay? But more to the point, there's, you know, this example, especially with sartorial adornment, where it's like, what's true and what's not? So we have a lovely headline from the New York Post to help us here. Dressing like a lesbian is sexy, powerful, new trend, fashion expert says. Okay, these are a couple of straight women wearing queer fashion. And what I'm bringing into this is in St. Erkenwald, we had a corpse that looked like a king and turned out he was a judge. Okay, if you saw these women on the street, you'd think, wow, they look kind of queer. Okay, they're not. But the point over here, it's like, you know, this is a little bit, you know, this is pretty great, but like the point is that even today, your heuristics don't necessarily work. You need inquiry and you need this leap of faith. Those are simultaneous here. So the point over here is that, you know, there's this draining of signification in this example that a fashion expert, she's saying, well, it's great this is in the mainstream, but it's also drained of its signification. And the point over here is that the material thing and what it signifies, even despite all appearances, are not one and the same. So what we have over here is this is an actual gay person. All right. And then these are not actual gay people as far as I'm aware. Never mind Bella Hadid looking like a grandpa lesbian chic core, okay? And then that's Emma Watson, and I would say, what? But the point over here is that you're, you know, this is supposed to be an engaging example to really draw you in and say, if you weren't paying attention, you should, if you weren't paying attention, you should really be paying attention now, because I was called sir from behind wearing that outfit, okay? But what I want you to think about is when you look out into the world and you think you know what you know, whether it's, no, we did not share classified plans in Houthi PC small chat, whether someone looks like they conform to a certain identity on the street, whether even a ring that they're wearing is real Swarovski or just some random cheap thing you got on Amazon. The point over here is that for a long time, material things, heuristics, vices, virtues, all the ways that we look and we know are really not so stable. And these poems are worth looking at because they are complicated, they are intricate, and they have beautiful verse, but they also really make us work. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Quite self-conscious about my outfit now, and I'm delighted to say that I think only Eug Xu can follow up that. That's a hard act to follow, but this will be perfect because it's really a pleasure for me now to introduce the last talk in our first panel from Eug Xu, who is a senior in the Penn History Department with a minor in the Digital Humanities. Eug is in the History Department and minoring in DH, Digital Humanities. So I've gotten to, Eug is also a library person, and I see her a lot. She's class I'm teaching this semester, and I've gotten to witness up close her amazing skills, both as historian and as digital scholar. Those are not easy to work those worlds together, and she's doing it in impressive ways. As you'll hear in this talk, she is a global historian. She works on merchant and craft economies, the history of clothing and textiles, and she's performing this in her research today. As a research assistant in our Department of Research Data and Digital Scholarship here in the library, she's working on AI ethics. We really need that. And she is also a theater person who does, as she puts it, miscellaneous tasks. I suspect they're the vital tasks that actually make the theater run. A tip from Eug on our theme of clothing, to which I think we could return in discussion. We should ask Eug about their skirt, which they've made for this conference. So I'd like to hear that answer too. But before we get there, let's hear Eug, who will present her talk today called Modes of Bookkeeping, How Material Samples Illustrate the Limitations of VOC Trading Expertise. Eug, thanks so much.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to once again welcome you to the Wolf Undergraduate Research Conference, and once again to our first panel of the day, Global Connections and Toxic Luxuries. My project, I should move slides. Is this the right? Yes. My project, titled Modes of Bookkeeping, How Material Samples Illustrate the Limitations of VOC Trading Expertise, used a new approach to non-textual evidence to fill in gaps in our understanding of the Dutch East India Company. I will be referring to it as the VOC. In terms of spelling, it's VOC in English. That's just how I'm used to talking about this company. And their institutional knowledge of the Asian textile goods at Delton. By examining the underutilized 584 surviving textile samples attached to 37 VOC documents, along with the surviving residual evidence from samples that haven't survived, my project reveals a striking lack of textile literacy in the VOC officers who procured these materials. So to outline my paper and this presentation structure. My thesis began with an introduction that established both the affective and historical background of this project, laying the groundwork for the human experience of interacting with surviving scraps of beautiful textiles in a public archive and for the world of the VOC. Chapter 1, which I titled Numbers, Threads, and the Limitations of Method, discussed the divisions of the VOC historiography into two methods, the economic historical method and the art historical method, which rarely crossed over due to key differences in evidence usage. As a result of this historiographic divide, the VOC's surviving textile samples enclosed in letters have been underexamined. My next chapter, Chapter 2, Cotton, Clay, and Commerce, demonstrated how this gap can be addressed through borrowing conclusions from histories of the VOC's porcelain trade, which has had greater success in blending methods and therefore coming to interesting conclusions. For the purpose of this presentation, I will be grouping chapters 1 and 2 into one historiography section because, to be very honest, those two sections of my thesis are incredibly dry, and devote more time in chapter 3. I'll welcome any questions about the specifics of my historiography later. And finally, chapter 3, Uncertainty and Imprecision within the VOC's non-textual bookkeeping, proposes that textile samples within VOC documents can be interpreted as a key form of economic data. The samples are not curious, attractive anomalies within the VOC's archive, but rather their own form of non-textual economic bookkeeping. And finally, my conclusion discussed the nature of colonialism, imperialism, and corporate rationality, and how non-textual bookkeeping offers a unique window into these processes, intricacies, and failures. So to start, I would like to read you an excerpt of my introduction and play a video that I had taken in my research. To play the video, should I just press the next button or on Paul's end? No, you're good. I'll keep reading as we try to figure that out. Entertain me for a few minutes and imagine that it's a July day in the still cloudy Dutch summer, and you are there with me in the reading room of the Dutch National Archives. The stunning textile samples enclosed within the papers of the VOC are regarded as some of the National Archives' most precious holdings. To view one such document in person, an archivist or I had to submit a special request, checking off a box indicating that the document was a topstuk, best translated as a masterpiece, which would then require us to seek permission from the archives department head or a senior member of management. After receiving approval, I could also only sit at certain tables within the reading room to make sure that no damage could be done to the materials. Once I moved past the bureaucracy involved in keeping these invaluable documents safe, the sample-containing documents proved to be eye-catching. Every time I opened one of these documents, at least a couple of people, including both other researchers as well as various employees of the NA, would stop to peek over my shoulder or ask a couple of questions about the intricately patterned cottons or the lustrous silks that I was viewing. These textile samples were also often accompanied by equally impressive and detailed drawings of porcelain, as well as of other items, including everything from intricate clocks to rare birds rendered feather by feather. I spent hours in that reading room gingerly handling these samples. Beyond being beautiful, I noticed that every sample had its own character. Some of them were pasted forcefully onto the fragile paper, creating stiff spots on areas of the page. I traced my finger around the twisted weave of the fabric, mimicking the motions of how the bookkeeper, centuries ago, must have attempted to maneuver the fabric with his sticky gum or starch-covered hands, and gently prodded the corner of one of these pasted samples, which had begun to lift. It has been over 200 years and nothing has fallen off yet, I thought to myself. He did a decent job with what he was given, even though the textile's distorted weaves were frustrating my attempts to note thread counts with a borrowed ruler. The textile samples within the VOC's archive are utterly captivating. Not only are they beautiful pieces of craftsmanship, they are also all visibly marked by the hands that had attached them to the page. Why had they never been comprehensively cataloged? I'm gonna have to pause the video there, I'm very sorry. I can show you more of them later. I'd like to offer a brief overview of the VOC's history and the Asian geographies that the company interacted with as background for the rest of my research. The VOC, chartered in 1602 and dissolved in 1795, was one of the world's first examples of a large joint stock company, or one with shareholders who held stocks which could be bought and sold. Despite being a single corporate entity, the VOC was never of one mind. From the very beginning, the company was characterized by disagreements and a constant internal struggle for power. The VOC not only imported, but also derived its profits from inserting itself in existing trade circuits in the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. The company purchased a dizzying array of Asian goods, predominantly spices, but also precious metals, indigo, saltpeter, tea, coffee, sugar, and the decorative goods, such as textiles and porcelains, available in these various geographies. To do so, the company established trading bases, termed factories, across strategic cities in Asia, a practice also adopted by other European competitors in the region, particularly the English, which my other two panelists have talked a little bit about. The VOC's operation reshaped different regions in Asia with varying degrees of severity. Indonesia and Ceylon experienced exploitation and later direct colonialism. India experienced a somewhat more balanced trading relationship that was still exploitative to a degree, and Japan and China experienced very little impact due to their empire's protectionist policies. Now, an overview of the historiography. I promise this will be very quick. Historians have taken interest in the VOC for many reasons. To some, it was their employer. To others, it was a key aspect, proud or shameful, of their national history, or one of the earliest models of modern corporations, or a vicious precursor to state colonialism, or a vector in the global distribution of Asian goods. As such, an astonishing volume of historical works has been produced about the VOC in the past 3 centuries, starting from within the company itself, and the archive still continues to reveal new questions. Over this time, historians have redefined their craft and refined their historiography. They're democratizing previously inaccessible archives, levying critiques against the company's colonial perspective, applying VOC evidence in creative ways to answer new questions, and initiating cross-disciplinary dialogue. In the 2020s, we seem to be confronted with a new methodological shift. In reaction to a boom in global and commodity history in the 2010s, more recent publications from historians interested in the VOC's trade have begun to further explore the global implications of textile circuits through dialogue between art and quantitative data, an avenue that had not previously been explored. Here are some of the key authors in the VOC historiography that I wanted to highlight for you all today. However, the impressive size of the historiography has also generated divisions within it. The division I examined in my thesis is between the economic historical and the art historical methods. Economic historians of the VOC have thus far focused almost exclusively on the numbers contained within the company's papers, while art historians of Indian textiles have worked mostly from surviving textiles within large museum collections. I argue that the lack of synthesis between these two methods has caused these stunning textile samples, which are plentiful in the VOC archive, to be treated by historians as one-off curiosities rather than as a part of a unified and coherent form of bookkeeping. The divide between economic and art historians, two disciplines that study functionally the same history, is so wide that a quick flip through the pages of any given text about VOC textiles would immediately identify it with one camp or the other. All the economic history books, without exception, contain numerous pages in their appendices of neatly and impressively compiled charts full of numbers. On the other hand, all the art history books, without exception, contain numerous pages of awe-inspiring images of South Asian textiles, usually printed on glossy paper in full color to convey their full effect. The textile samples enclosed in the VOC's documents have therefore gone unnoticed. The economic historians of the VOC don't have the textile-specific know-how to interpret the samples as their own body of evidence, and the art historians are used to working with bigger and better preserved pieces of fabric. The one group of VOC historians who have managed to bridge this disciplinary and therefore evidence-based divide are the historians of the VOC's porcelain trade. The second chapter of my thesis therefore argues that porcelain is an apt historical and historiographic comparison to textiles. Dutch textile and porcelain trade circuits both involve entry into intra-Asian circuits facilitated by complex networks of intermediaries that existed long before European involvement. The two goods were both produced by laborers and artisans with substantial autonomy, and they both involved procuring decorative goods that entered Europe with exotic connotations at first, but eventually became more commonplace collectibles. Despite many striking parallels, historians of the porcelain trade have managed to arrive at more complete and nuanced conclusions about the quality and nature of VOC expertise in porcelain as a valuable commodity than textile historians have. While very little is known about the textile experts hired by the company, its porcelain experts, the nature of their backgrounds, and the limitations of their knowledge have been substantially better documented. The economic and art historical evidence of Dutch porcelain circuits greatly resembles that of textiles. Economic data is found in numbers within VOC papers. Surviving Ming and Qing dynasty porcelain goods make up a lot of this art historical evidence. Even more striking is this. In the same documents that the VOC attached textile samples to clarify the demands, the VOC also attached drawings of porcelain goods, and this slide displays some of these drawings. These drawings got cited and interpreted in porcelain historians' works. The textile samples in the same inventory numbers did not get the same treatment. Historians' interpretations of these drawings also tended to include that the company really had very little knowledge of how Chinese porcelain technologies worked. The question then becomes, does looking at textile samples in a more rigorous way reach the same conclusions? And with that very leading question, if you haven't guessed, I think the answer to that question is yes. Contrary to what historical writing on the subject would suggest, there are so many textile samples in the VOC archive. This slide displays 4 tables that gives you an overview of where and how many samples there are, and these numbers lead to 3 key conclusions. First, these samples are not rare archival anomalies. I counted 584 samples in the archive. Many of these documents also contain traces of textile samples that had fallen off the page and been lost. I counted 44 such traces, meaning that there were at least 628 samples originally attached. And there may be still many samples and many traces that I haven't counted before. Second, these samples survive in multiple different collections held by the NA, not just the main VOC collection. The largest number of surviving samples pertain to the Chinese silk market, the majority of the samples from the VOC collection, as well as all the samples surviving from the Canton factory collection, were of such silks. The second largest was the Japanese factory collection. These samples were compiled not by the VOC, but by the Japanese College of Interpreters as demands for the Dutch company to fulfill. And next, 36 samples of Dutch woolen cloths survived in 2 previously completely uncited documents in the main VOC archive. And finally, 26 samples survived from a sample book, or also called a monsterboek, held in the Dutch West Indies companies, or the VIC collection. Though the VIC was a separate enterprise from the VOC, these samples are the most frequently cited ones in the VOC historiography. And third, the existing literature on the VOC sample sending practice is focused on the wrong documents. The importance of sample sending has been a well-established practice by historians. However, that history has been more focused on the VOC monsterboek structure. The monsterboek structure was undoubtedly incredibly important to the VOC's textile trade. These booklets were frequently referenced in VOC correspondences as means of managing their orders and broader financial strategy. However, as there is only one surviving monsterboek, which came out of the VIC rather than the VOC collection, the historiography of VOC textile trade seems to have largely given up on the possibility of working with surviving samples in a substantive manner. While there is only one true document that is labeled a monsterboek that survives, I've identified 6 other documents that are very similar in structure and therefore possible to use to study the monsterboek structure. But even then, by far the most prominent document structure that contained textile samples was the ICE or demand document, not the document that is called the monsterboek. And now to look at the documents themselves. This is where I start freestyling. So this first slide displays a number of two documents that I found, both of them in the VOSA main collection, and both of these documents are demand documents for basically the procurement of silks in China. I want to give you a couple of key points that I'm listed here. First, on the first document to the furthest left, you will see a number of textile samples attached, but you'll see gaps between these samples. If you look really closely, you'll see little yellow dots between these gaps. That is where previous samples would have been attached. I've seen a lot of these dots. I've also taken a look at how these samples were attached to the document. Those are little dots of wax that are used to glue the samples to the page. Obviously, if you think about that tiny dot of wax holding an entire sample to the page, things are going to fall off. So this is kind of what I mean by the uncounted evidence, the residual evidence of previous samples that were attached. The second document also gives you a sense of not only how the samples were attached to the page, but also how documents were structured to accommodate these samples. You will see that a lot of demand documents, especially ones pertaining to textiles, have this sort of hanging indent structure. And that is to leave room for the attachment of other samples. You see this structure in a lot of demand documents that don't even have samples attached, which means that people were thinking about the possible attachment of drawings or samples because this was a thing that happened fairly frequently. And then the third document is one that I found in the same inventory number as the first two documents, but that inventory number also contains about 1,000 pages worth of stuff. The rest of these are in pages 500, 600 range. This one with the little red wax dot is somewhere in the 100 range. So it's not next to the other samples that have textiles attached, but if you look at that little red dot, you will see residual silk threads on there, and that red wax was also used to attach other samples. So that gives you a sense of what kind of evidence we're dealing with, in the sense that there is numerous evidence, and there's also more evidence of even more evidence that didn't fully survive, but that leave traces in places in the archive that people haven't even thought to look. Ooh. Help, sorry. There we go, thank you. The next document that I would want to look at is the monster book structure. So the one on the bottom is of the Weisse monster book. That is a ship that is headed from Zeeland, which is in the south of the Netherlands, to Guinea for the slave trade, which is what the Weisse kind of dealt with, the west side of the kind of Atlantic trade. These are Indian cotton goods that are being traded in the Atlantic slave circuit for enslaved individuals. That is the structure of the monster book that we see kind of surviving. The other document is from the Japan collection. That is a VOSA related document, even if it isn't compiled by the VOSA. That document is also not actually labeled a monster book. It's called a Preisliste, which is like, a list of prices. And you can kind of see the length and width and the sorts of price numbers in that book. But you can see that they are functionally identical in structure. It would be insane to not call that second document also analogous to a monster book and to claim that we cannot study the structure just because we don't have surviving examples that are labeled the word monster book. The next page is one of a number of Chinese silks. And the first one that you will see on the left of the more colorful samples, that is from 1755, and the later one is from 1795. The key difference between these two is that they are both very exemplary forms of the VOSA not really knowing what they're doing. But you can see a decline in the quality of their knowledge from 1755 to 1795. In the first image, the passage that is attached in this demand document basically says these attached swatches with the names they were given are suitable to purchase for all the precise colors in accordance to their labels. In the previous years, there have been many I didn't add the extra many, but there have been many miscolored purchases made. Therefore, these serve as samples of what to buy. So this is in reaction to the Dutch company not knowing what they're buying. The second image goes completely off the hook. It is actually incredibly hilarious how poor their expertise is. The writing here says, these samples mainly serve as evidence of the style of goods that are made in China. Most preferably, they would have left the bloom out of the center stripe where it had been stitched, and then later replace it with blooms of this style on the main lustring ground, but very lightly in a way that makes it seem like there's a fairly large distance from the others, such that it is neither too crowded nor too stiff, and furthermore, more variation in design is possible in the following colors. You're supposed to be attaching samples to show people what to buy. You're attaching samples and saying, don't buy these, buy some other textile that we don't even know if it exists. Goes completely off the hook. They don't know what they're doing. This next document is one of the Dutch woolens. And I tried to attach a higher resolution image here, so I'm not sure if you can see this, but you can see that all of the reds, all of the blues, all of the greens, all of the blacks, all of the yellows, all of these colors are very, very consistent, and they're labeled very consistently as well. I also tried to maximize this image as much as physically possible, but I hope you can kind of tell that these are woolens that are almost identical. They all kind of look the same, but all of them are technically slightly different weaves. So you have things that are labeled lakens, you have things that are labeled perpetuanas, you have things that are labeled schoongrassens, you have ones labeled lakengrassens. There are a number of different textiles that are labeled here, but you can see that the Dutch are being much more precise with textiles that they understand more natively. And then you can also see these are Japanese documents. So these are compiled by the Japanese College of Interpreters, not by the VOC. And the two things that you will notice here are the first document, which is kind of a demand document, differentiates between the phrase chitsen beste soort and vaderlandse chitsen. Beste soort is what you think it means, the best sorts of chintzes, and vaderlandse is what we would probably refer to Dutch reproduction chintzes. And you can see that there is a difference between these two styles, but the fact that they are making that distinguishment while the VOC isn't, in terms of the Chinese silks, gives you a very good sense of how lacking the VOC expertise on Asian goods specifically is. The next document is called a waarschuwing, which is a warning document. It basically attached a number of samples to descriptions saying, this is why we don't want them. And what you're seeing here, I'll go through this a little bit more quickly, is that they're talking poorly about the quality of specific Dutch lakens. And then also they're talking about how they're distinguishing this woollen stuff based on the two categories of perpetuana and is it kroonrassen, which are pretty much identical to my eye. And they're talking about the quality of these documents in a lot more detail than we see in the Dutch side. So this chapter therefore argued, not all VOC bookkeeping occurred in charts and lists of numbers. The company's archive included a staggering volume of textile samples, with document structures built to accommodate them. The surviving samples follow two strong trends. First, that VOC samples of Asian textiles are uniquely poorly done. And second, the quality of the company's compilation of Chinese silk samples steadily worsened between 1755 and 1795. The company's consistent lack of textile expertise and its trajectory of decline over time coheres with conclusions that historians had arrived at regarding the company's porcelain trade, that the VOC was unable to infiltrate and understand markets of decorative goods, a fatal flaw that contributed to the company's downfall. So what does this mean? This thesis holds two key conclusions. The first is about colonialism, imperialism, and corporate rationality. Interpreting the textile samples and the VOC documents helps us reframe conventional wisdom on decision-making powers of corporations like the VOC, which later morphed into colonial regimes. The samples there are the surviving manifestations of textile economy's resilience against encroaching economic control. Colonialism and imperialism can only be sustained when armed enforcement of economic territory is considered necessary to control markets. The modern irrationalities of the multinational corporations are also not a 21st century phenomenon. They are woven into the fabric of modern corporate structure, starting from the 17th century VOC. And my second conclusion is about the method. Corporations, starting from the VOC, frequently do not have sufficient information about their own goods to optimize their decision-making. And I hope that my examination of VOC evidence makes that clear, that economic information is not always stored in rationally or intelligibly. If you think about startup culture now, for example, you can think about a lot of startups that try to make goods that the owners themselves don't actually understand. This is the exact same situation that is happening with the Dutch company. I propose that my method should also be applied to other corporate records, including modern ones, like the ones that I suggested. VOC textile samples are only the beginning. We should look at patents like this. We should look at the other drawings in the archive like this. There are many, many things that we can do with this methodology. And finally, although this thesis only has one author, it was put together by a village. One of my core arguments is methodological. Diversity in methods, interests, and skills are the keys to a better comprehension of the formidable structures that seem much more rational than they are. This hypothesis is rooted in my incredible and diverse support networks throughout this process. The names on the slide are only a small but important fraction of the crucial cheerleaders, mentors, and institutions who went above and beyond to help me make this project impossible, including the Wolf Humanities Center. Cool. And I'll just give you a sense of my bibliography. Here's all the documents. Here's my primary bibliography. Here's my, oh no. That's not my secondary bibliography, but it can be my secondary bibliography.
Turn it right over to the audience. We're ready to go. We are ready to go. All right, questions, please. Julia.
Well, while we're thinking about more serious questions, I think Eug, you invited a question about your skirt.
Oh, yeah. I can talk about the skirt. So originally, the project that I proposed was about specifically the changes in colors when textiles arrive in Europe, because there's a very strong trend of textiles being sent to Asia being red or blue or other colors, and then once they move to Europe, the textiles turn white in background. So this skirt is made from a fabric that I ordered from a company called Shivalaya Jaipur. So they do kind of historically inspired handloom textiles that are also block printed, which is one of the forms of textile production that exists in the period. A lot of the textiles that I talk about are painted, but a lot of them are also block printed. The thing that's interesting about this textile in particular is that it mimics the sort of style of colorfully grounded textiles that existed in the textile economy earlier. And they have colorful backgrounds for a very practical reason. They're resist dyed, so there are places in the textiles that are stamped or painted with a wax, and then they dye the entire thing, so then it makes sense for the background to be colorful and for there to be negative space. This textile is in that style, but it is dyed with indigo and then printed on top with white, which is like a form of production process that only becomes one that's sensible and profitable after the kind of colonial change when they move to Europe and they're not doing the resist dyeing anymore. So that's the story about the skirt. Yay.
David Wallace, hold on for the mic.
Oh, what a phenomenal panel. My God, what brain power. Amazing. Just a quick question. So, Jen, I think oak is itself interesting, isn't it? Because I think oak had been exhausted by about the 14th century. So the bows of Agincourt were actually imported from Poland. So, I mean, oak is not a native, it masquerades as a native wood, but it isn't really. And Wordsworth was, in that whole area, I was asked, well, given that nature is so beneficial, why not build a railway from Manchester? And he said, no, the working class should take the quickest route out of Manchester, which is prayer. That was his response. There was also a great photography project where a black photographer from London simply photographed herself in the Lake District. That's all she needed to do, the incongruity of that. Daphne, the status of the tear that falls from Erkenwald, and that's really, really interesting because it both seems to confirm a kind of systemic reading, also dissolve one, doesn't it? Maybe you say something about the tear.
Yeah, so...
that's enough for now. Okay.
Okay. So yeah, in Saint Erkenwald, what happens specifically is after the saint talks to the corpse and the corpse miraculously speaks, is Erkenwald in his, faith and prayer sheds a singular tear on the corpse, and then the body dissolves. And what's specific is that all the adornments, all the sartorial adornments, it's quite specific in the text that the robes, the scepter, this crown, they all dissolve. So I do agree that there's sort of a double reading over here, that it's simultaneously these questions about faith and virtue are important, but it's also, I think, quite important that the text specifies that the adornments are the ones that fall off. and there's this real sense of truth and materiality being linked together. And, I think we've seen that across all these panels over here, the issues with material stuff versus how they're talked about or documented. So the Erkenwald example is particularly interesting, but I think that's also present across all our speakers today.
Yeah, I wondered if maybe the three of you could talk a little bit more about what seems to have emerged as this questions of clothing. To be a little more specific, obviously in your talk, Jenny, clothing is not the only issue, and skin color and identity are crucial as well. But would you like to talk a little more about clothing in De Quincey and how it is both a marker of identity and somehow alien or something like that? Obviously for Daphne, your warning about clothing and identity is sort of woven throughout your talk. The sumptuary laws as background here seem particularly important, and a social attempt to regulate what people wear, which seems to sit uncomfortably with a manuscript, a set of poems which warn against appearance and how it's deceptive. And then for Eug, your work is, of course, massive and of a very different sort of, it's a different kind of project, and yet what more can you tell us about how these samples, not all of which I suppose were used for clothing, but may have circulated beyond this archive? So any thoughts you guys have on what we wear and how we wear it?
I can talk about one of the samples that I don't actually look at in my research, but I find very fascinating. So I mentioned that there were two samples or 2 pages of samples attached involving European woolens, and I only showed one of them. The other one is one that I find absolutely fascinating, and I need a military historian to talk to me about this. It's a page of samples of lakens, which are like broadcloths, a kind of very heavy Dutch woolen fabric, like a felted Dutch woolen fabric. Samples of those lakens for different military officer uniforms for people who are deployed into kind of the military side of the VOC's like kind of colonial enterprise. And the thing that I find absolutely fascinating about them attaching lakens is that these are like heavy, heavy winter fabrics. And if these samples end up in Indonesia, who's sweating to death, right? And then also like if you end up in, for example, the islands south of Japan, yes, in the winter, that's appropriate. In the summer, who's sweating to death, right? So there is like this interesting history, which I think Jenny can also talk about how sartorial appearances, especially for Europeans living in tropical climates, both in Asia and also in the Americas, as colonizers, there is this like sartorial like urge to distinguish themselves from native populations. And then there's also this fascinating history of those fashions being looked down upon by Europeans to be like, oh, these people have kind of been made savages by the kind of like tropical weather there. So that was one thing that in the archive that really struck me, in the sense of like, who is wearing these textiles in these environments? And is this like a question of kind of appearance over practicality?
I want to start off by saying that clothing is not really one of the primary focus of my project, but it does really appear in De Quincey quite a little bit, especially with the Malay's turban. And so clothing as identity here, I think of this, I would start to think of this as a part of the Orientalist discourse that De Quincey uses to characterize the Malay for us. And so in my presentation, I kind of talked about how, like, why De Quincey may have identified this figure as a Malay. So one thing is sort of the trade relations. The other part of it, which is really broad, because not only Malays wore turbans, but a lot of different cultures and places in the Arab Muslim world at the time also wore turbans. So I think it's a part of this like totalizing tendency that De Quincey has as an Orientalist to use clothing as a way to demarcate difference. And there's also been some scholarship that does address clothing, and I think like I would point to John Burrell, who thinks about the turban a little bit more in relation to De Quincey's own biographical experiences and the turban as something that might have some sort of like hypochondriac disease underlurking it.
Daphne, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, what we've been talking a lot about here, especially commodities, so items to be traded and sold for their exchange value, not their use value, right? A little bit of, you know, Marxist language I think is really helpful because the problem and what Marx tells us about the commodity is that it's stripped of its use value. It's all that you do to trade with it. And that's what happens with something like a sort of a sumptuary law, that there's, to some extent, signification, use value has been drained out of these items. All that's left is the exchange value, this kind of empty thing, you know, saying, oh, I'm wearing purple doesn't mean royalty anymore. It's just for a trade. And, you know, I think that Eug's project is especially attuned to this just because it's in a later period that really sees a pickup in multinational trade, and Jenny as well, just with the, you know, use of opium as a huge, you know, trade commodity weapon. But even in this earlier period with, the, you know, the very early rise of internet, even though international trade has been happening forever, but in this really particular specific 14th century English context, just looking at the use and exchange value of these luxury materials because they are being traded. There's a real interest in them. Spices are a really important one as well. But these kinds of luxury goods and this clothing, it's really related to the commodification process, I think.
A final comment, David, and then we'll take a break.
I think my huge question, but I thought you ended with a really
Hold on one
important point.
second.
You ended with a really important point about the disconnect between the company and knowledge of actually of its commodities, which I think is a very current one, because I live next door to Wharton entrepreneurs, and they said when you're developing a product, you often don't know what it's going to be, what it's going to land, and then occasionally you get prosecuted. Remember that woman who went to prison for over-promising on a recent cure? That all entrepreneurialism seems to live in that gap, which you've articulated really beautifully and historically.